Hey, Matt. Matt, can you hear me?
How's it going?
Oh, it's going well, yeah. Sorry, if sometimes I miss you, I have you on speakerphone on my cell phone because I can't get the earpiece to work, so... But,
it's a problem, but hopefully it'll work out.
I think this is on the minor side of the various technological problems we've had. So I'm confident.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be blocking heads without some technical problems.
That's what I always say.
Right, exactly. And speaking of technical problems, I guess. Well, problems. The Republicans seem to have a lot of them, and the polling situation looks sort of increasingly dire for them in the midterms, to the extent that thanks to the internet era and the speeded up media cycle, where there's sort of already people discussing who's to blame for their electoral defeat, which hasn't even occurred yet.
Yes, no, it's precriminations, which is even better than recriminations because you don't have to be bogged down by pesky details about which senators actually won and which senators actually lost.
Right, and you don't have to go through the exit polls, get very dull. There's a lot of data there. It sometimes even takes months for a really full picture of what happened to emerge. So it's easier to talk about these things just sort of in the absence of information. And I guess not surprisingly, conservatives of different stripes all feel that conservatives of different stripes from themselves are primarily to blame for this.
Yes, that seems to be the consensus. And I thought I'd sort of throw out my take on how this debate is shaping up, and then see what you, as a liberal on the outside looking in, think about who's to blame.
I'm detached and objective.
Right, exactly. So I actually did a blog post about this today, but I think one of the emerging strands of sort of Republican self-criticism, and the one that I'm starting to suspect is going to be latched onto most eagerly by the media and by people sort of outside the Republican tent, is the idea that really religion is to blame. That the GOP is captive to fundamentalists, and that this is dragging the party down to defeat on all sorts of levels and alienating them from regular middle-of-the-road Americans and so on.
So you're thinking of Ryan Sager's book?
Yes, Ryan Sager's book. It's Andrew Sullivan's book, but it's also I've noticed it in the sort of MSM mainstream media reactions to these books, which are sort of an uncritical acceptance of this idea that the GOP is captive to its Southern evangelical base, and that everything and that all the various strands of what's gone wrong with the GOP have at their root evangelical Christianity or theoconservatism or whatever you want to call it.
And there's definitely in the press, it seems to me, a kind of morbid obsession with social conservatives. So that I remember in the mid '90s when the Republicans sort of did poorly a couple cycles in a row in '96 and '98. This was all because things had gone too far. The social conservatives had captured the party. It was terrible. Then when the Democrats lost a few cycles in a row, in 2000 even when they didn't really lose, and then 2002 and 2004 when they certainly did lose, you heard that the Democrats were desperately out of touch with religion and with Red America and with cultural values. And now, just 2 years later, the Republicans look poised for defeat. And again, it's the same thing, right?
Well, some of it is just religion is more interesting to talk about than
people like to attribute to this same basic underlying dynamic. Which I think it captures some truth, because obviously social conservatism is an increasingly important part of the Republican Party, but lots of people don't like it. But at the same time, it can't be used to explain everything. It can't be the ups and the downs.
Well, and what's happened, I think, with Andrew Sullivan's book, and you saw it with Kevin Phillips' American Theocracy too, even though Kevin Phillips would no longer call himself a conservative. In order to explain, why the Iraq War went wrong, or why, the prescription drug bill was such a fiasco and so on, people tie themselves into knots trying to explain how these things were really just manifestations of, in Sullivan's term, fundamentalism.
Right.
And in fact, you mentioned 96 and 98, and I think in those elections, particularly 98, less so 96, there was a strong argument to be made that, with Clinton's impeachment and sort of the obsession of social conservatives with Clinton's adultery and his sex life and so on, that in those cases, the GOP's problems really were, social conservatives were really front and center for the things that were causing the GOP problems then. I think in 2006, and again, I'm curious what you think, but the biggest issues, the things that I think, like sort of the elusive swing voters or sort of disappointed Republicans or disappointed Bush Democrats are voting on, are mainly the Iraq War, the sort of general perception of GOP corruption, K Street, Abramoff, the Page scandal, and so on, and then sort of the broader problem that the GOP always has, which is that their economic agenda is perceived as being, too favorable to the rich and big business. And in none of these things are social conservatives really a crucial part of the equation. It's true that, like, the religious right, like everybody else in the Republican Party, was sort of along for the ride on Iraq. But, the people who, if anyone were discredited by the Iraq War, it ought to be sort of the neoconservative hawks, who are not the religious right. Similarly...
Yeah, no, I think the only real way you can say that the religious right has played a significant role in the Republican problems at the moment is just that I think the willingness, the extent to which it seemed possible to mobilize a mass constituency purely around kind of symbolic cultural battles, I think has encouraged the sort of a lack of thinking about domestic issues that sort of characterized the past couple years of Republican governance. I mean, it's gone from a situation where the Bush administration had a kind of domestic economic agenda that, would be criticized as too favorable to the wealthy, to one where there's really no agenda at all. But I mean, I think it's unfair to try and pin that on social conservatives per se. I mean, rather than on the party elites, I think, mistaken understanding of, how far they could just sort of count on waving the bloody shirt of gay marriage as the way they mobilize their constituents.
Well, and I think there's also, Dick Armey just wrote this open letter to Republicans, I guess, or maybe it was to Ryan Sager or something, and it was essentially a long attack on James Dobson and various people for sort of leading the GOP into big government ways, basically, by, I forget the exact details, but, maybe regulating gambling on the internet and things like this, and Army saying, no, you can't get in bed with the devil that is big government, and this is why we're going to lose. And I really think arguments like this are just a way for Republicans like Army to hide the fact that, or not hide the fact, but sort of obscure from themselves the fact that it's the small government policies of the Republican Party that are the most deeply unpopular part of the Republican bushel of issues. And it doesn't mean that they're wrong about, it doesn't mean that Dick Armey's wrong that, we should have more and still more tax cuts and more and still more spending cuts and so on. But pretending that the GOP is about to lose because, Southern evangelicals were too favorably disposed to expanding Medicare or something.
No, I agree. I mean, you see the Cato Institute, which obviously has a sort of vested interest in this argument, was, trying to put out this paper arguing that there's this really large libertarian swing constituency, and that's been alienated by the Republican Party spending too much money. And I've just seen almost no, real evidence for that. I mean, certainly the prescription drug bill did not bring as much in the way of political benefits, I think, as its advocates inside the Republican Party hoped it would. But, I've never seen any evidence that it's actually hurt them at the polls. Especially compared to the alternative, which presumably is what Dick Armey and Ryan Sager would have wanted Bush to do, which is to just say, no, there will not be a prescription drug benefit. People are forgetting that was, for several years, far and away the best issue the Democrats had was that they were going to create this benefit for senior citizens, and the Republicans weren't. And it was, really politically necessary for the Bush administration to come up with some kind of counterproposal that inevitably was going to involve, spending money of some kind on something. I think we can fairly question whether, even from a purely cynical point of view, the bill they actually came up with was the smartest thing. But the idea that insufficient small government orthodoxy has caused any of this doesn't seem very credible, especially because it didn't hurt Bush in 2004.
Mm-hmm. Well, so
right, there was an election. If you're looking at a change, right, the growing unpopularity of the Republican Party, you have to look at something that changed recently, which seems primarily people's perceptions of Iraq.
Yes. Well, that, and I guess this was my question for you, but if you were a Republican, pundit or consultant or something, and you were asked to say what happened to the Republican Party between 2004 and 2006, you would say Iraq, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that seems good. If you ask what happened to the Democrats between 2000 and 2004, what happened was 9/11.
9/11, right?
What's happened to the Republicans now is Iraq.
Okay, well, I guess we agree, which is maybe no good at all, but it's still. But I do think it's still a point that bears repeating, because I think there's a tendency for pundits to get really deep into the weeds, either sort of hunting for specific issues that make them sound smart, or hunting for pet issues that. It's like, oh, the Republicans lost because all the gamblers of America were mad at them for regulating internet gambling. Or the Republicans lost because the deficit hawks were enraged about this. And in some cases that can be true, but in the case of the last 6 years, I think foreign policy is such a huge issue.
Right, and especially it's the dynamic issue. It's the one that really large numbers of people have changed their minds about, and that the parties,
myself
have
included, and you included,
perceptions of them.
Yeah.
Right. The extent to which people cared about Iraq policy has, varied wildly, and what they think about it changes. It's going to leave, if the Democrats win, win the House at least, as they're projected to, it's going to leave the party in an odd situation of sort of having come into power primarily propelled, by this Iraq issue, which is really the thing that a narrow congressional majority is sort of least well suited to try and do anything about.
Right. Well, I guess that leads into another topic, which is, should the Democrats want to win this election?
Well, you see. I think every year somebody soon before the election sort of writes the cutesy argument that maybe you don't want to win this one, and there's always a certain amount of truth to that. There's always a lot of risks that come with responsibility, and it always seems like, well, it might be better to let the other guy kind of stew in the problems for 2 more years. But it ultimately has always just struck me as a kind of silly way of looking at the world. The future is sort of inherently unpredictable, and the best you can do in any given election cycle is try to win.
Right. But this one in particular, I think there's been a lot of debate on the Democratic side over the last 2 years about, for instance, how much effort to pour into battleground states this time around. And, Howard Dean has become famous for taking, what's called the 50-state strategy and trying to build up Democratic infrastructure in states where the party probably isn't going to be competitive in 2006, but maybe they could be in 2008 or 2010. And again, I'm not sure if this is true, but some people have said that people like George Soros have been funneling money, again, into long-term projects rather than 2006. So it does seem like, on the Democratic side, basically everybody wants to win, but some people seem more excited about winning now, and some people seem more excited about, the infrastructure for 20 years of Democratic dominance.
Right. Well, there is... obviously, there's a difference between looking at the fact that the Democratic Party has been losing a certain number of elections in recent years. And then there's the other thing, which is the perception that liberalism, as an ideology, has been sort of losing steam over the course of decades, right?
Right.
And so, the infrastructure project, it's not just a question of long-term versus short-term, but also of, what is it exactly that you're trying to accomplish. I mean, if you want a sort of more far-reaching alterations in American politics and public policy, nothing that's in the 2006 Democratic legislative agenda is really going to achieve that. I saw a different KO item today talking about libertarians and why they might abandon the Republicans, and the guy was just pointing out how unalarming he found the Bush administration's, alarmist take on the things that a Democratic Congress was going to do. That this Republican press release was trying to say, the Democrats were going to nationalize the healthcare system, but actually there's only 10 co-sponsors for that bill.
Right.
So I think there's a decent case to be made that if you are primarily interested in, pretty serious structural changes in the United States, you need to finance, institutions that will help build a constituency for that kind of thing, and not get too distracted by what happens this November.
I guess I don't quite see, and maybe as a social democrat you can help me out on this. I understand that liberalism as liberalism has fallen into disrepute. But part of the reason it's fallen into disrepute is because so many quote-unquote liberal programs were enacted. I'm always a little bit curious if, what is the far-reaching plan for remaking U.S. politics? What would U.S. politics look like in 2025 if, the most starry-eyed dreamers at the Center for American Progress had their way and everybody started reading different books and believing different things? I mean, you'd have universal health care, right? But what else?
Well, I think this is the point. I mean, if the starry-eyed dreamers in, Matthew Yglesias' house, if I had my way, then the people who have the sort of views that you see at the Center for American Progress, right, Gene Sperling and so forth, would not count as, the left wing of American politics. We would not have a Republican Party that sort of tries to actively promote growing income inequality, and a Democratic Party that doesn't really care one way or the other. Mm-hmm. It's not totally obvious to me. I mean, I'm not an economist. I don't really have my 5-point plan for curbing inequality, that I can pull out here. But I would like to see people of a more technocratic bent, working on such a plan, and that's not something that the Democratic Party, as currently constituted, stands for. I mean, you see very little, at least professed concern from the Democrats in this country about poverty, other kinds of things. And you see a country that, despite the increasing sourness on the Iraq War as such, still seems, very prone to a kind of, militaristic nationalism. And it's not that I think, I'm not naive enough to think that, the Democrats should adopt all of my policy preferences and go take that to the people, this year or even 2 years from now. But I would certainly be interested in seeing people invest money in trying to see if constituencies can be built for these ideas.
But let's just take the example of income inequality that you brought up. I mean,
right.
Sure, okay, George Soros could invest large sums of money in programs.
Admittedly, he's a kind of unlikely candidate.
Right. He personally is an unlikely candidate, but we'll use him as a stand-in for sort of the money that might be funneled to various causes.
Guilty rich man acts.
Right. You could invest in shares and programs and all sorts of different things. But in the 2006 election, I mean, one thing that I think seems to be happening is you have a lot of Democrats out there running on something close to what might be called the Thomas Frank theory, the what's the matter with Kansas theory, which is that Democrats need to be more economically populist, talk more about helping the have-nots, talk more about economic insecurity, and so on. And it seems like this is, what you have with Sherrod Brown in Ohio. It's a little bit what you have with Harold-Ford in Tennessee. You've got it in races all around the country.
Well, I mean, you have it in what Harold-Ford. I think like that's what Harold-Ford would like the voters of Tennessee to think Harold-Ford thinks.
Right.
But I mean, if you look in the way that only dull political sophisticates do at like what Harold-Ford's actual policy views are. He's, extremely conservative, not just or even especially on social issues, but on economic ones as well. I mean, as for a Democrat especially. I mean, he was a Social Security privatization sympathizer, and as far as I know, it doesn't have any kind of real. I don't even like the word.
I know
populist, it seems to me, is a kind of style of campaigning and not like a real agenda for doing things. Sherrod Brown is a very substantive liberal guy, but so John Tester is running in Montana. Like talks about how he likes guns, but also populist, quote unquote, economic policies. But I'm not sure that those populist economic policies actually amount to anything other than a kind of like vague suspicion of foreigners.
Well, I know you you don't think immigration has really anything to do with sort of the economic struggles of the working class, but I mean there are people who think that, and right. A Democratic Party that was took illegal immigration more seriously, some people might say was doing something at least to address sort of the problems of Americans with low-wage jobs and so on. I mean, a lot of the debate about illegal immigration comes down to people who say, well, it creates economic growth, versus people who say, well, sure, but it's bad for economic inequality and it hurts the working poor. I mean, I don't think you can just dismiss out of...
I mean, some of it does come down to that, but I mean, I guess to some extent, right, I mean, this is exactly the sort of situation, the structural situation in America that I'm complaining about, which is that seemingly the only thing that the political system as a whole can think of as something we could do to try and deal with income inequality is to blame Mexicans. It's like inconceivable that we could, redress this through the normal, policy mechanism and
Well, why isn't that a normal policy? Why isn't that a normal policy mechanism?
Immigrants and so on and so forth. And I mean, I guess so. My idea of trying for long-term change would be for trying with a situation where the debate isn't, so narrow that the question is, well, either we do nothing or else we're going to build a wall across the southern border of the United States, and that's the entire extent of the debate about inequality.
Well, I mean, I don't see why curtailing illegal immigration isn't a normal policy solution. It's a policy solution that you don't happen to agree with. But generally speaking, I think you're missing the fact that, if these populist campaigns succeed, they have at least somewhat changed the language of American politics a little bit. And that, I mean, you can't just, it's not enough for populism to succeed in persuading the wonks at the Center for American Progress or something. I mean, at some point it has to win elections. And there is something to be said for, sure, even if Harold-Ford is sort of a bogus populist or John Tester is fundamentally a bogus populist, I think a lot of the things that you believe in, and some of the things that I believe in, are so easily dismissed out of hand as sort of losing issues. That just having populist candidates win. I mean, look at what happened with Al Gore in 2000. How many times have you read a story saying the reason Al Gore lost was because he took up this people versus the powerful rhetoric, right? Now,
sure, I've read it a few times.
You've read it a few times, yeah, a few dozen, 100 times or something.
Yeah, a million times.
Right, and
but not in the pages of the American Prospect, where we always believe that more populism is.
Right, but I mean, there's an idea, and a very powerful idea, in sort of elite political circles and elite journalism circles, that populism is a political loser. That Americans don't want to hear people versus the powerful rhetoric. They don't want to hear anyone question the benefits of free trade and so on. And it seems to me that, as someone who I know you don't have sympathy with sort of anti-illegal immigration campaigns, but as someone who has sympathy with sort of the nest of issues that gets called economic populism,
Sure.
you would I mean, it would be really good for you to have an election where the Democrats were running on economic populism and where they swept, 40 seats and took over the House majority or something.
I guess it is. So, I guess you're saying if the Democrats win with a lot of what's understood to be populist rhetoric, that if there's a victory, that will sort of, changes the dynamic, that then all of a sudden, populism is cool, so to speak, and maybe more thought as to, what exactly it entails would follow from that.
Yeah, and I mean, the counter-argument...
And I guess, presumably, it depends. It depends what the impact on the Republican Party is, I suppose, right? One thing it seems to me I would really like to see happen is if the Republicans get kind of, scared into adopting Ross Douthat-ish views on economic policy questions, if they decide they're, really at risk of losing unless they do that. I think, that kind of shift in the Republican Party really opens the door to, much more ambitious kind of proposals.
Right.
In that sense, that could be true. On the other hand, I do think that people will, when they look at the election returns, probably wind up taking a deep breath and actually realizing that this was largely attributable to Iraq, and that you're not necessarily going to see any sort of long-run consequences at all out of this midterm.
No, that's true, and so I guess our first point in this dialogue sort of knocks all our other points off the table in that sense. But
I don't really know, but it seems to me that. Who knows? Possibly people can be tricked into thinking that something else is happening. If I had believed that not only was the Iraq War, really bad, and that its architects and supporters sort of deserved to be punished at the polls, but if I thought that Nancy Pelosi had the ability to sweep in and actually, make the situation dramatically better,
right,
then I would think that winning the election could be a stepping stone to, all kinds of good things for the Democrats down the road. But, I don't think anybody, not me, not you, not Nancy Pelosi, actually thinks that a Democratic House can substantially improve that particular situation. The things they can try and do, they can raise the minimum wage, they can do this and that. But the main thing that people in the country sort of would really like to see happen as a result of this election, it just isn't something that it's in anyone's power to deliver.
Well, that's true, and that I was about to suggest, as a parallel, that a case where winning an election had serious ideological effects was the 1980 election, where just the mere fact that Ronald Reagan campaigned and won on a small government message was in and of itself sufficient to create more of a space for small government rhetoric in American life. That before 1980, no candidate had ever won on that kind of, no national candidate had won on that kind of platform, and once Reagan was able to do it, it opened the door for small government conservatism more generally. But, as you say, Nancy Pelosi coming in is not the same thing as Ronald Reagan coming in. And I guess that's where you do have a good point, that this election, one thing this election doesn't fundamentally change is the sort of the leadership vacuum in the Democratic Party, the sort of, or at least on the congressional side. There are a lot of figures from Hillary to Obama to Gore who might be, leadership figures for '08. But in terms of the people who are going to become the face of the Democratic Party after a 2006 victory, I guess I agree with you that, Pelosi's no Reagan. But let me ask you, because you've blogged about this a little bit. So
sure.
What does happen after the Democrats take power? Assuming again that they do, there seems to be there's sort of a Nancy Pelosi versus I don't even know how to Steny or Steny Hoyer.
Steny, I think. Well, I mean, Nancy Pelosi is obviously the top Democrat in the House, and she is substantially more liberal in her profile and affiliations than are either Steny Hoyer or Rahm Emanuel. Steny Hoyer is a kind of Hoyer's one of these guys who's like really well liked by his colleagues, and seemingly very few other people are incredibly enthusiastic about him. Zach Roth has a good profile of him in the Washington Monthly, which calls him the establishmentarian, which sort of sums it up. Rahm Emanuel is sort of a more dynamic, compelling figure who a lot of guys like Joe Klein, who are sort of liberals but actually loathe liberalism, and the Democratic Party, are all kind of really enthusiastic about Rahm Emanuel. And there's been this kind of, for months now, I found, curious thing where sort of more centrist people have been trying to set up the argument that insofar as the Democrats win, Emanuel deserves all the credit, but insofar as they disappoint, Pelosi deserves all the blame for that. So I think there's going to be some kind of tensions, between the two of them if they're in charge. I'm not totally sure what kind of form that would take exactly. Except that there's inevitably going to be controversy as to what Democrats should do with oversight and subpoena power, which is something that the rank-and-file liberals are very excited about, and that I'm not sure conservatives have totally contemplated how that's going to go, except for a sort of vague sense that John Conyers being in front of the camera must be good for Republicans. I don't know what you think. I mean,
I think conservatives have...
my sense is that conservatives mostly just assume that these House Democrats are very liberal, and that, if they're put front and center before the American public, this will just kind of catapult in their favor.
I think that the Republican mind is divided. I think on the one hand you have that hope that John Conyers in front of a camera is automatically bad news for the Democrats. On the other hand, and again, this sort of breaks down, I think, on Iraq War lines, if you have the Republicans who are terrified of that just because it's going to prevent George W. Bush from doing the visionary, far-sighted foreign policy things that he needs to do, because, he won't have a Republican Congress to help him along with those. And so I think the Republican Party, in a way, and this is the general divide in the Republican Party between the people who are saying, maybe it'll be better if we lose, or we kind of deserve to lose, or I'm not excited about this election. And there are a lot of conservatives and Republicans saying that. And on the other hand, the sort of rally the troops, we need to fight on the beaches, fight in the streets, and so on. Right. It's, if you read National Review Online to the corner, it's the argument between, John Derbyshire on the one hand representing the, conservatives need to stay home and punish the GOP, and Catherine Jean Lopez on the other hand saying, no, there's a war on and the president needs Congress on his side. And then with, I think, someone like Ramesh Ponnuru, who actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying, here's the silver lining for Republicans if they do lose. But I think Ramesh represents sort of the typical Republican thinker who's sort of pulled in one direction or another. But so much of this, I think there's a huge and widening fissure in the Republican Party just based on, do you believe in the sort of global war on terror, Iraq as the central front in the war on terror rhetoric anymore, or don't you? And I think that, all that Catherine Jean Lopez has to say to rally people who still believe in that is, look, there's a war on. The president needs Congress. He doesn't need Congress, questioning his authority. He needs Congress supporting his authority.
But, this is why, in an odd way, I sort of feel like the Democratic Congress is going to encourage further adventurism. Because, foreign policy gambits are sort of the traditional presidential escape from a hostile Congress.
Right. But, so many... What foreign policy gambits are left to Bush? It seems to me like the gambits that are left to him...
Well, it's hard to say, but, surely he can come up with something.
I mean, maybe so.
There's always bombing Iran.
There's always bombing Iran. Bombing Iran is harder
It's a popular choice.
with a Democratic Congress, particularly a Democratic Congress that takes its sort of ability to impede a president's war effort seriously. I mean, well, yeah, what do you think would happen if the president...
Yeah, but Bill Clinton, it was pointed out to me when I was complaining about this and Bush and Iran, he started bombing Serbia without any kind of congressional authorization.
That's true. I
don't think Bush takes a, say what you want, I don't think he takes a more restrictive view of executive authority than his predecessor.
No, but I suppose... Yeah, I guess it all depends on, how willing the Democrats are to sort of stand up and be counted in opposing an attempt to bomb Iran. I mean, it's,
right.
with Clinton and Serbia, there were plenty of Republicans who sort of took the isolationist tack and so on in that era, and many of them were in congressional leadership, but there was also a pretty vocal contingent of conservatives who were all for bombing Serbia.
Sure.
I wonder how many...
but not a, congressional majority.
Right. But, I wonder...
at least I assume Clinton would have asked for a vote if he thought he was going to win. Right.
Maybe.
Maybe not. Maybe it's just a point of principle. I guess I shouldn't speculate on that because probably there's probably someone who had an actual answer to that question.
Yeah, well, so I guess, yes. So maybe Bush would be encouraged to more foreign policy adventurism as an escape. But I feel like the U.S.'s options overseas are so constrained right now that... the Republicans, and I don't know that many Republicans in government, but the people I talk to at the State Department and Defense Department and so on are really, they've got their hands around their heads waiting for, the subpoenas to come rolling in. I think
right.
the Republicans who actually work in government, and particularly in the agencies that would be affected, are not sitting around, cackling gleefully waiting for Charlie Rangel or John Conyers to put their foot in their mouth. They're actually scared. Not scared in some existential sense, but just scared in the sense that, their life is about to become much more difficult.
Right. Well, and rightly so.
Well, you would say that.
So, I don't know. What else we got? Barack Obama?
Well, then there's the question of 2008 and, do the Democrats, we've been talking about 06, assuming that the Democrats are going to win in 06, then they have to do what the Republicans failed to do in 1994 and 96, which is parlay a congressional sweep into a victory in the presidential election 2 years later.
Right.
And
that means... it would be good to find a charismatic figure who, increasingly we've seen people writing their columns and magazine articles about Barack Obama. I think a friend of mine, Ezra Klein, put on his blog. I think that liberals should be suspicious of anyone who comes so highly touted from David Brooks and Joe Klein.
Joe Klein, right.
As Obama does, but on the other hand, part of Obama's shtick is this thing about bringing people together and conciliation and unity, which I think is, on merit, it's a terrible idea, but that's exactly what you want to pretend you're going to do on the campaign trail.
Well,
so. I don't really know what to think of that. If he means it, that's ridiculous. But assuming he's a canny, lying politician, then I'm quite impressed by his ability to convince people that he means it honestly.
Well, and you could see a very fruitful, if the Democrats have won in 06, a candidacy like Obama's that's supposed to be bringing people together could be very fruitful, and you could have him. He's playing good cop to the Congress's bad cop. A lot of what happened...
that's exactly what you're going to want to do. Because there's going to be all these hearings and subpoenas and so on and so forth if Democrats are in the majority, and people are going to get, quote-unquote tired of the partisan wrangling and whatever else, and we'll be looking for a figure who will rise above it all.
Well, and that's precisely what Bob Dole wasn't able to do in 96, was that, you had this sort of pitched battle, this war going on between Clinton and the Republican Congress, and if there had been a Republican candidate who could have risen above that, he might have had a chance against Clinton. But instead you had Dole, who was not only personally combative and dour, but was personally associated with that wrangling. Now the problem for Obama is that, like Dole, he's in the Senate. So he's not going to be able to escape from the wrangling the way, say, a governor would be able to. A Mark Warner, shall we say, who, of course, just dropped out of the race.
The other thing about Obama, in contrast to Warner, is that, the last seriously contested election that Barack Obama ran in was a primary to be the Democratic nominee for the Illinois State Senate in a kind of South Side Chicago district. You know, he had what looked like it was going to be a very tough primary fight to get the nomination to run for Senate, but then his main opponent, imploded, and then he had no real rival in the statewide election. So that even though he seems like a skilled politician, there's no actual evidence of those political skills, and the way that Mark Warner always struck me as actually a little dull and uncharismatic. But you couldn't deny that he won a statewide election in Virginia, which is a difficult thing for a Democrat to do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was on the run Barack, run bandwagon, even before David Brooks and Joe Klein were. But I agree with you that he. One of the reasons I think he should run now as opposed to later is because he is such an unknown quantity. He is sort of, you can say all you want about the virtues of having been tested in the national election, but the more tested you are, the more weaknesses you have in subsequent elections that people can exploit.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, Ryan Lizza in what was, I think, the original, Obama 08 article, he makes the point that inexperience is a considerable virtue in these things. The thing is that you rarely have someone with so little electoral experience, meaningful electoral experience, as Obama has. I mean, even your average, like John Edwards, right, who was a one-term senator who started a presidential campaign, at least had faced a real difficult Senate campaign to unseat an incumbent senator in a southern state, and so winning that election was a considerable political achievement. And then you say, well, okay, maybe better for him to go sooner than later before he racks up all these problems. Whereas Obama, it's not just that he hasn't, achieved much substantively in just a few years in the Senate, but he hasn't even, really, he's never faced off against the Republican Party in a serious electoral contest.
It's true. Yeah,
which seems that's a problem. I mean, it doesn't strike me that a presidential election is where you want to roll the dice like that. That I mean, for all we know, his nice guy persona will evaporate the instant he's subjected to a hard-hitting attack at it.
But it's so hard to know what you should and shouldn't test in a national election. I mean, in 1992, it seemed obvious that the Republicans were going to, what was Lee Atwater's phrase, or somebody's phrase, they were going to shell Clinton like a peanut, that, you couldn't nominate somebody who had, bimbo trouble and draft-dodging trouble and so on. And, but still, the reason to nominate Clinton, and of course Clinton was a much more accomplished politician than Obama, but, one of the main reasons to nominate Clinton was that Clinton was someone who looked good on the cover of Time magazine. Clinton was somebody who got people excited.
But, it does seem to me that you need to look at just look at the record in these things. That now, ever since John Kerry lost the election, everybody says, "Oh, I can't believe the Democrats thought nominating him would be a good idea." But I remember, before that election, lots of people thought it'd be a good idea. Oh well, he's a veteran, he's tall, he's craggy, whatever. But, ultimately, I think what you needed to know about John Kerry was that this was a man who, as an incumbent Democratic senator in Massachusetts, almost got beaten in the most recent, close race he faced. And that shows a guy who, has some political weak points. Whereas Bill Clinton, despite a lot of problems on paper and also some assets on paper, what you could say about him was that he won a whole bunch of elections in the state of Arkansas,
right.
which is tough for a Democrat to do. I would be looking for, if apparently not Mark Warner, but someone who, like Mark Warner, has, proven some ability to win in a typically conservative state.
Right, but who's...
at least from an electoral point of view.
Okay, but so who's left?
Who's left?
From that roster.
There's a whole bunch of governors, though, these days.
I mean, well, look, Phil, again, guys whose names I've only read and never heard. Is it Phil Bredesen? How do you pronounce his name?
Phil Bredesen. I think he actually has a substantively appalling record.
Okay, so he's out.
Napolitano. There's lots of people out there.
Right, but I mean... Napolitano isn't going to be president of the United States. Neither is,
Bill. Obviously not, because we're going to get Hillary Clinton. But
well, right. But if you're
that seems ill-advised, nonetheless.
I think so much of the reason for the Obama phenomenon at the moment is that, particularly with Warner dropping out, you're running out of names very quickly.
I feel like the DC-based media has a sort of tunnel vision about this. I mean, is it a coincidence that the only people who the sort of political press think are viable candidates are the people who are already U.S. senators or who are governor of the state that they mostly live in?
No, of course not.
Right. So Mark Warner is a big deal, but every other Democratic governor of a red state nobody's heard of. And I mean,
no, it's not. It's not a coincidence. But
if the nomination process works well, it's the opportunity for one of these relatively anonymous governor-type people to, in the way that Howard Dean did, throw his hat in the ring and become well-known by the process of running.
Yeah, but you and I both know that that's not usually how the nomination process works, and that, if somebody's going to emerge as a challenger to Hillary Clinton, they're going to emerge soon, most likely. I mean, the Dean phenomenon was, again, we're coming back to the Iraq War, but the Iraq War created an unusual dynamic where there was this opening for someone to make a name for themselves just by being the anti-Iraq War candidate. And that's probably not going to happen in 2008. It's certainly not going to happen in the same way. I completely agree with you. Like, it's ridiculous that, the national media has this tunnel vision and so on. But that said, the fact that they do have this tunnel vision, the fact that Obama has emerged in this way, I think there's good reason for Democrats to get excited about him. You want a candidate who Joe Klein will write those kind of pieces about, even if you think that Joe Klein is a ridiculous figure. Americans read Time Magazine and Newsweek.
This is true. The Joe Klein vote is what you need.
I mean, I remember.
No, I mean that's true. I don't want to be an Obama hater. I think not until probably 6 weeks from now. That's going to be like the fashionable point of view, and I'll try and adopt it then.
Yeah, I just remember 1992 was the first election that I was politically aware of it all, and I just remember what a difference it made, the national media swoon for Clinton, and yeah, I mean, maybe with Obama, maybe it's happening too soon. There's so much time for the national media to discover all his flaws and swoon over other people. But the other thing is that he is armored by his race and by his background. He's not armored from dirty attacks in South Carolina primaries, but he's armored from the sort of usual tendency of the national media to just tear down people automatically, I think. I think
that's probably right.
I mean, there's a real...
It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, it will. We've never had...
precedent for...
But it's the way...
A black presidential candidate who's taken seriously. But, my intuition is that that's probably correct, that there will not be the willingness to sort of mock him.
But even look at what's happened Colin Powell over the course of his career. I mean, Colin Powell was a distinguished public servant, a good chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did good work in the early 1990s, depending on what you think about the Powell Doctrine and so on. Mm-hmm. But then became this sort of secular saint whose halo has really, I mean, even now, even after he was a manifest failure as Secretary of State, I mean, Colin Powell's halo has never really been tarnished in the national media. Like people don't go after Powell the way they went after Al Gore in 1999 and 2000. And maybe it's
that's certainly true. And I mean, I think race must have
something to do with it. Yeah, it will. It'll be very interesting to see if Obama. It's interesting to me though too that someone like Obama gets so much more favorable press overall than Harold Ford, and I'm curious why you think that is in particular. Like what
I actually think though, if you look back, that Harold Ford got press like Obama's press back in the mid to late '90s, and that people sort of got tired
of the Harold Ford. Yeah, that's
and that. They sort of come to the conclusion that he wasn't going places after all. Now he's made this gutsy move running for the Senate race. I do think if he wins, you may see a return of real interest in him. I'm told he's a really good, campaigner, very charismatic, so on and so forth. I just think people got a little bored with him when he didn't immediately rocket to superstardom.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Maybe that's it. I mean, because if he does win, which I think it looks like Corker's still slightly ahead in those polls, but
right. No,
but if Ford wins, then Ford
he's Barack Obama plus Mark Warner.
Exactly. And I mean,
right.
it's 2 years too late for him. He needed to be that in 2004, I guess, and then he could be the person everyone's talking up for 2008. But
right.
Yeah, just the idea of a Democratic sort of self-proclaimed or anointed moderate African American candidate, I think it'll be pretty hard for the media to resist a full-on swoon.
Oh, sure. Well, look, I mean, a black Democrat who wins statewide in the South.
Oh, yeah.
But everyone's got to love that.
Yeah, but the swoon, I mean, people are really down on Joe Lieberman now,
sure.
On your side of the aisle, but I remember how just the fact that, Joe Lieberman was the first Jewish nominee for vice president. That was like a month and a half of free great publicity for the Democrats.
Because you know who controls the media, Ross.
Well, there is that. Yeah, but we've addressed that topic before, so.
Yes. Well, I guess with that we should probably stop.
Okay. Well, maybe we can talk again. Either before or right after the midterms when we can actually have some data to analyze. But
we will revisit these and other topics.
Indeed. Well, it's been a pleasure, Matt. Thanks for chatting.
Okay. Great.
Talk to you
Bye.
soon. Bye.